Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. For those of you who weren't at the symposium earlier today, my name is Nick Mueller. I'm the President and CEO of the National World War II Museum here in New Orleans, and we're delighted to welcome all of you for this special evening. This is a wonderful conclusion to a full day of programming related to Sir Winston Churchill. But before we get to tonight's speaker, I'd like to take a moment to sustain a tradition in this museum that our museum always has for large public gatherings. We've done this earlier this morning for those who were at the symposium, but I'd first like to ask any World War II veterans who are in the audience to please stand and be recognized, and let us thank you for your service. Wherever you are, please stand up. We have several, 3 or 4 here. Thank you. And now I'd like to ask veterans of all wars to please stand and also be duly recognized. Regardless of your time of service, it's always an honor for us to have you here with us. So thank you for all you have done for your country and what you continue to do in our society. Tomorrow, on the 10th anniversary of the 9/11 terrorist attacks on our country, we're going to be paying special attention to our first responders who put their lives on the line then and for all kinds of emergencies throughout the year. And I want to just announce that the event tomorrow begins at 8:30 a.m. Here in this pavilion with music, courtesy of the United States Marine Corps. The formal 1-hour program begins at 9 a.m. and I hope many of you will be able to join us. Tonight's address, the General Raymond E. Mason Distinguished Lecture Series, takes its name from a great patriot, a World War II veteran, benefactor to this museum, and a great friend. General Mason was also, after World War II, a great business leader, successful in his professional life, and he and his wife both believed in the educational mission of this museum so much that they donated the endowment for this lecture series. It has been going on now for several years, and it should be noted it was the very last gift of the Mason Foundation in 2007. Sadly, General Mason is no longer with us, but his commitment to preserving the memory of World War II and educating future generations about this pivotal event in the 20th century will be felt for a long time to come because of his generosity. Tonight's Mason speaker, Dr. Raymond Callahan, is a University of Delaware Professor Emeritus of Military History. Now, he and I share a common friend, Dr. John Hurt, who was also a Professor of History at the University of Delaware. And John and I were both earning our PhD degrees together in history and European history back in the 60s. And he was down here last spring, and he heard me talk about this symposium, and he said, "You just got to get Ray Callahan to come down and address our group," and that's how this happened. Of course, Dr. Callahan's works are well known to many of you in this audience. Churchill and his generals, the worst disaster, the fall of Singapore and Burma, 1942 to 45, and his works, his scholarly works alone, commended him immediately. So we knew that he was a scholar to be reckoned with and a great speaker. And as we learned more about him, we became immediately convinced that we ought to extend an invitation, and we're so grateful that you have. Dr. Callahan served as the Associate Dean of Arts and Sciences at the University of Delaware, along with his previous teaching career, and had previously held the John F. Morrison Chair of Military History at the U.S. Army's Command and General Staff College. Among his other works, or Churchill, is Churchill, Retreat from Empire. So ladies and gentlemen, tonight presenting the topic, What Churchill Left Out, some thoughts on Churchill, India, and the Second World War. Please welcome Mason's distinguished lecturer tonight, Dr. Raymond Callahan.
Thank you very much, Dr. Miller. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be here. It's an honor to be asked to deliver the Mason Lecture, and to have been part of today's activities, a very interesting symposium, and with any luck, I will sustain the interest for about 40 minutes more. Over 40 years ago, a distinguished British historian, A.J.P. Taylor, remarked of the massive series of British official histories that their attempt to impose anonymity on politicians, generals, and civil servants alike broke down when it came to Churchill. After all, no one knew who the Vice Chief of the Imperial General Staff was, but everyone knew who the Prime Minister was. And thus was created what Taylor called the perhaps misleading impression that Churchill ran the war all on his own. This sense of Churchill's central role in Britain's war was reinforced by, of course, by his massive war memoirs, which were rather disarmingly described by Churchill himself as my story. Rather more correctly, they were described by the powerful cabinet secretary, Sir Norman Brooke, as very likely to become, for most people, the quasi-official history of Britain's astounding war effort. Brooke, of course, was right. For a generation, while the archives remained closed to all but official historians, Churchill's volumes, studded with documents, thanks to Brooke, remained the key source for students of Britain's war. By the 1970s, when the archives slowly began to open, a narrative of the Second World War had already taken shape and become embedded in the popular memory of the Anglophone world. And that narrative was Winston Churchill's. And so, in large part, it remains to this day, not the least of that remarkable man's accomplishments. But in the lengthening perspective of time, and with the accumulation of detailed studies of nearly every aspect of the war, it has become clear that Churchill's account needs, shall we say, a few adjustments here and there. It is one such adjustment that I'm going to offer to you this evening. Churchill created his effects in writing his memoirs not only by a careful selection of material, but by an equally careful selection of topics. Some, of course, were unavoidable, like the collapse of France and the Battle of Britain. Others were treated much more summarily and sometimes evasively, like the fall of Singapore, one of the pivotal events not only of the war, but of the 20th century. It was one that Churchill was not eager to discuss in detail, nor did he. He delegated the writing of that chapter to his military assistant, Lieutenant General Sir Henry Pownall, and merely added some of his own inimitable minutes to Pownall's narrative. An even more striking instance of the way he shaped his narrative by selection and omission is found in his treatment of the war, to which the fall of Singapore was the curtain raiser. Britain's South Asian War against Japan, a largely forgotten conflict that was the swan song of the old Indian Army. It is that war, neglected by Churchill in his memoirs, and thus largely unknown to posterity, even in Britain today, that I want to discuss with you this evening. In the opening chapter of Their Finest Hour, Churchill breaks off his account of the construction of his national government to discuss what he called the scale and force of the contribution which Britain and her empire made to what eventually became the common cause of so many states and nations. In some ways, this is a peculiar departure from his narrative flow by a man who was always very careful about narrative flow. A comparative assessment of Britain's contribution to victory would seem to have been better placed at the end of the memoirs. But then one notes that Churchill confines his comparison to the respective roles of Britain and the United States in order to underscore one of the great themes that his memoirs would develop: how much final victory owed to Britain, and thus the importance of continuing the Anglo-American partnership. In this connection, Churchill printed a table entitled "Land Forces in Fighting Contact with the Enemy," which demonstrated that until July 1944, what Churchill termed British Empire land forces outnumbered American at the front, both in the war against Germany and, more surprisingly, in the war against Japan. This table is very interesting, and it is worth parsing because it is the starting point of the argument that I will make to you. The first point about the table is that it ignores the massive Soviet war effort, which occupied well over half the German army from June 1941 until the end of the war. But it also ignores the nature of Britain's war. Churchill pointed out that Lend-Lease allowed Britain to fight as if it were a nation of 58, not 48 million. But of course, Lend-Lease was incapable of changing demography. Britain was very thoroughly mobilized, far more so than the United States. The British conscripted women, for example. Britain maintained a huge navy, a massive merchant marine, and built the huge air force that pulverized urban Germany, while simultaneously sustaining the industrial and agricultural basis of that vast war effort. It simply could not also find the men for a continental or American-sized army. Only 28 ethnically British divisions served overseas during the war. And some of these were broken up before the war's end to provide reinforcements for the others. By 1944, Britain was, in a very literal sense, running out of men. Nearly half the forces Churchill listed as deployed against the King's enemies on the 1st of January 1945 were, in fact, Australian, New Zealand, South African, Canadian, Indian, or African troops. The impressive British war effort was, in fact, the work of a coalition of British, Dominion, Indian, and colonial forces, something that Churchill's table rather disguised and that his war memoirs underplayed. No part of that coalition made a greater contribution than the Indian Empire and its army, and no part received so little recognition in Churchill's war memoirs. By the spring of 1945, there were as many Indian infantry divisions as British in the British 8th Army in Italy, while the British 14th Army, led by the great Bill Slim, which had just victoriously concluded the most impressive campaign of the war under the Union Jack, was 65% Indian and only 13% ethnically British. The balance were Africans. The massive Indian contribution to Britain's war effort was left out of Churchill's account, and with it the fact that India's wartime contribution was a turning point in the history of South Asia. Why this neglect? Thereby hangs my tale. Churchill and India. This subject has always been a difficult one for those of us who admire Churchill. His stand against what became the 1935 Government of India Act is well known, although not from the gathering storm where it is all but completely ignored. Well known also is his naked fakir jibe at Mohandas Gandhi. What is less commented on, and what is very pertinent to my argument, is how little Churchill really knew about India. He had certainly been there for a few years as a subaltern in a British cavalry regiment. Most British Army officers spent some time in India at some point in their career. But being in India was not the same as learning about India. British cavalry officers in Churchill's time, and for a long time afterward, cultivated a lofty disdain for the rest of the British Army, not to mention nearly all civilians. Churchill's letters written from India, mostly to his mother, clearly indicate that he found the largely middle-class British who ran the Raj and its army rather beneath him. As for Indians, they were set decorations thought of in stereotypical terms. In many ways, this is not in the least surprising. Churchill was a desperately ambitious young man busy with his self-education project, his polo, his plans to use his time in India to build what we today would call name recognition, which in turn would help launch the political career he coveted. There was neither time nor inclination to learn much about the subcontinent. Many other British officers, as their memoirs attest, passed through India learning little more than that it provided splendid opportunities for polo, pig sticking, and shooting. But of course, none of them went on to become Prime Minister. One point about India, however, was very clear to Churchill, and might well have been equally clear had he never set foot there. The Raj was vital to the structure of British world power. India was the foundation on which was built Britain's Eastern Empire. It provided a cost-free strategic reserve that, given mobility by British sea power, projected British force and sustained British interests from the Eastern Mediterranean to the South China Sea. In the aftermath of his bitter fight against the blueprint for eventual Indian independence, the 1935 Government of India Act, Churchill, who had driven himself to the very margins of politics by his attempt to derail it, wrote a very revealing letter to the Viceroy, Lord Linlithgow. "My ideal," he wrote, "is narrow and limited. I wish to see the British Empire preserved for a few more generations in its strength and splendor." This was his core belief: to continue playing its global role, which he saw as beneficent, the British Empire needed to maintain its Indian Raj. This belief about India, not memories of the dusty cantonment at Bangalore where he had been stationed, or of exciting moments fighting tribesmen on the northwest frontier, this belief was what he carried into Downing Street in May 1940. It guided his conduct in relation to India for the next 5 years, but would never figure prominently in the record of those years that he left to posterity. Churchill's impact on the subcontinent was felt immediately and decisively in two areas: the politics of the Raj and the structure of its army. When Britain went to war on 3 September 1939, the Viceroy announced that India was also at war as a result of the King Emperor's declaration of hostilities against Germany. Constitutionally impeccable, it was in every other way utterly inept. Unconsulted, the Congress Party, which governed 7 provinces, won in the 1937 elections, the first held under the terms of the 1935 Act, immediately resigned. When the Viceroy rather belatedly announced in October 1939 that after the war had been won, the terms of the 1935 Act could be revised, it was too late. The Congress Party was estranged from the Raj. Then, in March 1940, the Muslim League made it clear what reward it expected from its support for the war effort: a separate Muslim nation to be called Pakistan. The partition of British India had entered the arena of politics. There matters stood when Churchill became Prime Minister. He named Leo Amery, a former schoolmate at Harrow, and a dedicated and ardent believer in empire, to his cabinet as Secretary of State for India and Burma. Amery immediately realized that something imaginative had to be done in India to rally the Congress Party, the largest of the Indian political parties, behind the war effort. He and the Viceroy therefore began to draft a plan which would give India dominion status, that is, independence, within a year of the war's end. Meanwhile, Indian political leaders from both Congress and the Muslim League would become members of the Viceroy's Executive Council. In effect, they would join India's own war cabinet. When this plan came to Churchill's attention, he summarily quashed it, sharply criticizing both Amery and Linlithgow. He then decided to draft his own offer to the Indian political world. In it, he said that dominion status was still the goal, but unlike Amery's draft, there was no timeline. And there was a new proviso, that no part of India would be forced into the new Indian Dominion. That is, there might well be a partition between Hindu and Muslim India. He reiterated that the 1935 Act could be discussed and revised, but only after victory was won, which of course was no advance from what the Viceroy had already said, and the Viceroy's statement had fallen very flat. Finally, Churchill said representative Indians would be added to the Viceroy's Executive Council. Representative Indians, however, was not the same thing as Indian and especially Hindu political leaders. This August 1940 offer, which goes unmentioned in Churchill's war memoirs, did not, needless to say, resonate with political India. But it is very important. It was Churchill's final word on Indian politics for the duration. Even the Cripps mission of 1942, mounted in response to heavy American pressure in the midst of the great imperial crisis touched off by Japanese entry into the war, did not go much beyond the August 1940 offer. Churchill simply would not countenance anything that in any way impaired total British control of the Indian war effort, a position he would maintain until the day he left Downing Street in the summer of 1945. Why was this so important? Churchill began what he called his walk with destiny as the strategic basis of the British war effort collapsed. At the beginning of the war, British planning assumptions had rested on fighting in alliance with France, as in 1914-18. These assumptions were shattered in the first week of Churchill's premiership. After his first and immensely disillusioning visit to Paris, Churchill asked the British Chiefs of Staff how Britain could survive and win in a certain eventuality. That eventuality, of course, was France collapsing, a prospect so grim that even Winston Churchill hesitated to put it plainly. The next several months were consumed with a mad scramble to improvise a strategy, first for survival and then for ultimate victory. And this is where India became critical. In early June, with the fall of France clearly looming, a proposal was floated in London to abandon the Mediterranean. Gibraltar would be held, but the Mediterranean fleet would be withdrawn, blocking the Suez Canal as it left. The Mediterranean Fleet commander, Admiral Sir Andrew Brown Cunningham, usually considered the greatest fighting admiral the Royal Navy has produced since Nelson, was absolutely aghast when the idea was put to him. A landslide, he said, in territory and prestige would result. Churchill needed absolutely no convincing. If France left the war and the Royal Navy abandoned an area it had dominated since Nelson's day, the impact on both British morale and neutral perceptions of Britain's chances would be devastating. No more was heard of the proposal. The War Cabinet never discussed it, and it finds no place in Churchill's memoirs. Nevertheless, it was one of the critical decisions of the war, especially for India. If the British position in the Middle East, which sprawled from Cairo to Baghdad and south to Khartoum, was to be defended, the first requirement was soldiers. In June 1940, when Italy entered the war, there were only 2 British divisions in the area, and only one of them was actually combat ready. Reinforcing them from Britain would be very slow and very difficult. The British Expeditionary Force left 10 divisions worth of equipment behind at Dunkirk. In June, the warehouses in Britain held enough to re-equip completely 1 division. They also held ammunition for barely a week's combat. Indeed, the only completely equipped division in Britain at that point was a newly arrived, completely inexperienced Canadian formation. If Britain was to hold its sprawling Middle Eastern empire and its vital oil supplies, a large number of divisions would be needed quickly. Only the Dominions and India could supply them. Australia and New Zealand would eventually send 4 divisions, 3 Australian, 1 New Zealand. South Africa, 2. All of Canada's divisions went to Britain. There were, however, problems associated with Dominion troops. They came from independent countries and there were constraints on their use. Their presence posed command problems. The Australians in particular were very, very suspicious of British senior officers. Most importantly, the limited white population of the Dominions meant that they were extremely casualty conscious. India, however, was different. The Indian Army had been the British Empire's strategic reserve since the late 18th century. The manpower pool it could tap was, for practical purposes, inexhaustible. Finding soldiers was never a problem. Military service provided both prestige and wages that were attractive by the standards of rural India, which supplied nearly all the recruits. Without conscription, the Indian Army would grow from 183,000 in 1939 to 2.5 million in 1945, the largest voluntarily enlisted army in history. As large as the British Army and larger than all the Dominion armies added together. Above all, the Indian Army's services did not have to be bargained for. It went where it was sent and did what it was told. In the fraught summer of 1940, it was told to grow as fast as possible and deploy to the Middle East as quickly as it could. The consequences of this decision, also never discussed in Churchill's memoirs, were profound. In 1939, the Indian Army was a long-service professional army that drew its recruits only from certain groups, the so-called martial races. Its reserves were tiny, and its still largely British officer corps had virtually no reserves at all. It had only just begun the modernization of its weapons and equipment, an unusually complex task for an army, many of whose recruits were illiterate. Plans for wartime expansion were correspondingly cautious. In 1939, the plan called for the Army to slowly double in size. By May 1940, it had grown by about a third. Then came the crisis of May and June. London directed the government of India to raise the largest army it could as fast as possible. The new target for 1940 was 6 infantry divisions and an armored division. This had barely begun when the 1941 program was superadded to it, calling for 4 more infantry divisions and another armored division. Before the end of 1941, the 1942 program was launched, 4 more infantry divisions and a 3rd armored division. In addition to these formations, vast numbers of base, support, and line of communications units were simultaneously being raised. It was a remarkable effort, but it came at a very high cost. Finding recruits did not present a problem, although the huge manpower demands would outrun the available supply of volunteers from the martial races and force the Army to widen its recruitment base, thus exploding the martial races theory and making the Army more broadly representative of Indian society than it had ever been. The supply of officers, however, presented a more serious problem. The post-World War I commitment to ultimate dominion status for India was accompanied by a promise to Indianize not only the civil administration of the Raj, but the all-British officer corps of the Indian Army. Progress, however, had been slow. By 1939, only about 500 of the nearly 5,000 officers in the Indian Army were Indians, and they were almost all subalterns or medical officers. The exponential growth of the Indian Army, at a time when Britain's own armed forces were also growing massively, meant that there was absolutely no possibility of finding enough officers anywhere but in India itself. This demographic reality drove a dramatic and portentous transformation of the Indian Army. By 1945, the 2.5 million man army had 43,000 officers, of whom 14,000 were Indian, many by that time of field grade, that is, holding the rank of major or above. These changes in the makeup of the army, hitherto the Praetorian Guard of the Raj, were decisive for Britain's future in India. By 1942, the Director of Military Intelligence at Indian Army Headquarters in Delhi was noting in a secret memorandum that freedom and independence were what Indian soldiers expected after the war. In 1945, the Commander-in-Chief of the Indian Army, General Sir Claude Auchinleck, himself an Indian Army officer, and the last and perhaps greatest British occupant of that position, could say that every Indian officer worth his salt was a nationalist. That observation sounded the death knell of the Raj. The Change in the composition and political outlook of the Indian Army, especially the officer corps, was not the only profound transformation wrought by the strategic earthquake of May-June 1940. There were huge issues of training, equipment, and logistics support to be confronted as the Army ballooned. The framework for open-ended expansion was a process known as milking. Regular units would surrender cadre for new units, which in turn would hive off cadre for the next wave of expansion, and so on. This would ultimately lead to units like those of the 9th and 11th Indian Divisions lost in the Malaya-Singapore campaign, which had, on average, only 2 or 3 pre-war regulars per battalion. The inevitable dilution in quality was compounded by a decision, understandable, indeed inevitable in the circumstances, to focus all training and unit organization on the needs of the Middle East. Even the Army's intelligence school focused entirely on the German and Italian armies. This would lead to raw recruits trained for the open spaces of the Middle East, lumbered by a scale of vehicles appropriate to desert war, and ignorant of the tactics of the Imperial Japanese Army, being comprehensively defeated by the Japanese in Malaya and Burma in 1941-42. And to the handicaps imposed by milking and training focused on one war only, were added enormous problems with the provision of equipment. India was overwhelmingly, at that point, an agrarian society, although industrialization had begun. It was recognized from the beginning of the Indian Army's modernization in 1938-39 that all major items of equipment, tanks, artillery, motor vehicles, would have to come from the United Kingdom. Once the war began, the Indian Army was in competition with the rapidly expanding, and after Dunkirk, frantically re-equipping British Army, as well as the Dominion and Exile armies for which the British supplied equipment. In these circumstances, only consistent direction and support from the Prime Minister could have ensured that the Indian Army's expansion was properly supplied. No such support was forthcoming. For example, in January 1941, a new unit was raised at Julandur in the Punjab, the heavily recruited province that in 1939 supplied nearly half the Indian Army's recruits, and also raised the money that bought the Spitfire, which hangs in the corner of this room. This unit, as the 1st Sikh Light Infantry, would serve with distinction later in Burma. But when formed, the unit's transport consisted of the adjutant's car, to which was added an assortment of bicycles, requisitioned civilian buses, and camels. The unit's initial consignment of weapons included 10 rifles adapted to use buckshot, and a vast amount of .22 caliber ammunition, but no rifles capable of using it. Sniper training was carried out with 6 air rifles purchased by the adjutant in the local bazaar. During an early exercise, the entire 800-man battalion was armed with bamboo mosquito net poles. This Sikh battalion, destined for a first-line combat role, began its training with less equipment than many British Home Guard formations. A few months later, a young British officer of the Indian Army, the 5th generation of his family to serve in India, was taking part in the brief campaign in Iraq that restored British authority there after a pro-German revolt. He was shocked to discover that the Iraqi Army's equipment, supplied under treaty from Britain, was far better than that of the Indian units that summarily and comprehensively beat them. In the late summer of 1941, Auchinleck, who had been summoned from his position as Commander-in-Chief India to take over command of Britain's Middle East theater, paid a flying visit to London to confer with Churchill. He raised the matter of the rapidly expanding Indian Army's equipment, or rather the lack of it, pointing out there was not a single modern tank in India, even though the Indian Army was raising 3 armored divisions. His concerns were brushed aside by Churchill, who asked him how he knew that Indian troops, if given full scales of modern equipment, would, quote, point their guns in the right direction. This astounding and deeply offensive remark, which harked back to memories of the 1857 mutiny of much of the East India Company's Bengal Army, memories which were still vivid in Churchill's youth, captures an attitude of suspicion and disdain about the Indian Army that Churchill could never quite rid himself of. Only a few months later, when Japan attacked, the two new Indian divisions in Malaya, 9th and 11th, were still not completely up to strength and had only just gotten their field artillery because only 36% of the guns needed for India's 1940 expansion program had yet been delivered from the United Kingdom. And the two divisions in Malaya were part of the 41 program. The first Indian battalions to encounter the Japanese in northern Malaya panicked in the face of Japanese tanks. They had never seen a tank or had any realistic anti-tank training. Writing to the Australian Prime Minister shortly afterward, Churchill described the 11th Indian Division's defeat to the fact that the Japanese had not been confronted by white soldiers. Equipment from the United Kingdom was slow to arrive and did so in insufficient quantities, and this fact would remain true throughout the war. But what India could provide for its own and the imperial war effort, it did produce in growing quantities, a remarkable achievement made at a very high cost. Industrialization was in its infancy in India, but the war and army expansion propelled it very rapidly forward. In October 1940, the Eastern Group Supply Council was formed in New Delhi to coordinate the supply and manufacture of war-related equipment everywhere from Britain's East African colonies to Hong Kong. As the conflict deepened, India became the source of small arms and ammunition, many foodstuffs, and numerous other items of equipment. Indian inland waterways provided shipping for use in the Middle East. Indian railways yielded up locomotives and rolling stock for use there, particularly on the Persian Corridor Railroad that hauled American Lend-Lease supplies from Basra in Iraq to Russia. All this came at a considerable cost to India's domestic economy, even as it generated real and considerable, if quite unevenly distributed, wartime prosperity. Indeed, in the opinion of Amartya Sen, the Nobel Prize-winning Indian economist, the distortions and price inflation that accompanied the Indian war effort were largely to blame for the tragedy of the 1943 Bengal famine, which claimed over 1 million lives. None of this, the Indian Army's expansion despite a desperate equipment shortage, and the scale and consequences of Indian economic mobilization, finds any echo in Churchill's war memoirs. There was one aspect of it, however, that he could not avoid at the time, although he said nothing of this either when he wrote. The financial costs were enormous. It had been agreed before the war, as part of India's slow progress to dominion status, that future Indian military commitments for imperial purposes, that is, military commitments outside India, would be funded by London. As the Indian Army grew into a huge force, sprawling by 1945 from Italy through the Middle East to Burma, and as the subcontinent became a vast supply depot, the charges debited to London escalated massively, eventually reaching £1 million a day, and ultimately totaling £1.3 billion by war's end. And these were the days when £1 billion was a lot of money. Contemplation of these sterling balances, as they were called, enraged Churchill, but they were inescapable. He intended to squeeze every possible drop of effort out of the Raj, and ironically, doing so contributed substantially to Britain's post-war poverty, a nail in the coffin of the great power status that he wanted so desperately for Britain to maintain. The Japanese entry into the war, which would inflict a mortal wound on Britain's Asian empire, forced Churchill to focus at least briefly on India, the only time during the war when Indian matters became priorities for him, and the only time when India's wartime history is allowed to intrude into his memoirs. It is therefore interesting to look closely for a moment at this episode. Churchill wanted to reassure his new, vital, and increasingly assertive American ally that he supported their China policy. He told the Commander-in-Chief, India, General Sir Archibald Auchinleck's successor, that if there was one thing he learned during his first wartime visit to Washington, the post-Pearl Harbor Arcadia Conference, it was the enormous importance of China to the Americans. Burma had been America's only remaining route for Lend-Lease shipments to Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek's government. Defended by more new, inexperienced, under-equipped Indian units that had been trained only for desert war, Burma had been rapidly lost to the Japanese, something about which Washington was very censorious, ignoring the fact that MacArthur had lost a much larger force to a much smaller Japanese one in the Philippines. To replace the lost Burma Road, the Americans had a two-step plan. First, they would mount an airlift from airfields in northeast India, which the British would have to build. Then a counteroffensive would be mounted, again by the British, to clear enough of North Burma to allow a road and eventually a pipeline to be built from Lido in India's far northeast to tie in with the old Burma Road, thus allowing American largesse to pour once again into the black hole that was Kuomintang, China. To carry out this policy, Roosevelt and George Marshall superimposed a U.S. Army theater called China-Burma India, or CBI, on British India, and posted as its commanding general the acerbic, abrasive, virulently Anglophobic Joseph W. Stilwell. The message was clear, and Churchill clearly got it. India would be the base for this China-oriented American effort, which of course drew American attention to India. Washington felt that engaging the Congress Party's support for the war effort would make India a firmer base, and began, rather clumsily, to pressure London and particularly the Prime Minister on the subject. The clumsiness arose from the fact that Franklin Roosevelt knew far less about India even than Winston Churchill. This led to the Cripps mission mentioned above. At this juncture, Gandhi, of all people, came to Churchill's aid. Underestimating the very considerable residual power of the Raj, Congress rejected the Cripps offer, which had been unyielding on the issue of British control of the Indian war effort, and then in August 1942 launched the Quit India movement, sometimes called the Congress Revolt. It produced the most serious unrest in India since the 1857 mutiny. When the Congress Revolt broke out, there was one complete, first-quality British division in all of India. And the map that you found on your seat, which indicates the size of the Raj in 1942, which remember is not only all of India, but all of what is now Pakistan, all of what is now Bangladesh. There was one British first quality combat division in that entire area, 14,000 men. The Quit India revolt was put down overwhelmingly by raw Indian troops from the vastly expanded army, many drawn from non-martial race backgrounds with no long family tradition of service to the Raj, and in many cases commanded by newly commissioned Indian officers. The Congress leadership had clearly hoped for disaffection in the army. None appeared. One might have thought Winston Churchill would have noticed this striking example of the Indian Army's fidelity. The aftermath, however, proved, unfortunately, that he did not. With Gandhi and the Congress leadership in jail, and the Americans silenced, at least about Indian politics, Churchill could concentrate on a strategy that would satisfy Washington that he was serious about supporting China, but without diverting resources and attention from his first priority, which was the European war. Shortly after the Congress revolt fizzled out, Wavell, urged on by Churchill, launched an ill-advised counteroffensive into the Arakan region of Burma, east of present-day Bangladesh. It's the coastal strip of Burma that runs down toward Rangoon. Some of the worst climate in the world in which to campaign, 200 inches of rain a year, and giant leeches. The Indian Army's deficits in training, equipment, and experience had, of course, not yet been remedied. More remarkably, Wavell, who was not an Indian Army officer, who came from the regular British Army, had come to the conclusion that the Japanese would not fight well if they fought on the defensive. This has to rank as perhaps the greatest tactical misjudgment of the Second World War. The result was a poorly conducted campaign ending in a debacle. Embarrassed again in front of the Americans, Churchill was positively incandescent. denouncing the Raj and the Indian Army as, quote, a welter of lassitude and inefficiency. You cannot beat Churchill for polemic. He first purged the high command. Wavell, whom he had already fired once for failing to defeat Rommel, was summoned home, treated to a tirade on the Indian Army's failings. 1857 was dragged out once again, only months after the Indian Army had stood firm against the Congress revolt, and fired again. Instead of going off into retirement, however, Wavell was named Linlithgow's successor as Viceroy of India, largely because no one else wanted the job. Auchinleck, also once fired, despite defeating Rommel, was summoned back as Commander-in-Chief India. Finally, Churchill embraced a solution for winning back enough of Burma to satisfy the Americans without depending on the Indian Army. The unorthodox tactics of one of the strangest figures in the history of the British Army, Orde Wingate. Wavell had long been Wingate's patron, first in Palestine before the war, where Wingate ran a barely legal counterterrorism squad, and then in the Middle East, where he organized and ran Ethiopian guerrilla bands that tormented the Italian occupiers. Wavell brought him to India to use in Burma, despite a suicide attempt that ought to have ended Wingate's career. Courageous and, to some at least, charismatic, Wingate was also utterly single-minded, intolerant of disagreement, insubordinate, and often brutal. A manic military prophet in the unlikely guise of a British gunner officer. This prophet's revelation, which he called long-range penetration, was to take a normal infantry battalion, break it into its component companies, which he rechristened columns, infiltrate it into the enemy's rear, coordinate movements by radio, resupply by air, while his columns wreaked havoc on enemy lines of supply and communication. Of course, by Western standards, the Japanese did not have much in the way of communications to disrupt. In February 1943, the 77th Indian Infantry Brigade, which was the formation's cover name, moved into Burma. Over the next 2 months, the Chindits, the name was derived by Wingate from the mythic beast that guarded Burmese temples, marched and countermarched across North Burma. They did minor and easily repaired damage and lost a third of the force. Of the survivors, a third were assessed as medically unfit for further combat. On this unlikely basis, a myth was built. Wingate had the luck to emerge from the jungle just as Wavell's ill-planned and ill-conducted Arakan offensive collapsed. New Delhi and London were frantic for good news from Burma. Spin is not a new invention. To the amazement of those who knew what had actually happened, the operation was presented as an outstanding success, and Wingate himself written up as a brilliant military innovator. He seized his opportunity with both hands, producing a report carefully written to make the case for more and bigger Chindit operations that would sweep the Japanese out of Burma. Wingate sent a back-channel copy, thus violating military regulations, Wingate's norm, to Amory, who was another of his collection of patrons. Amory, in turn, gave it to Churchill. The result was everything Wingate could have wished. The Prime Minister needed to prove to the Americans that the British could and would retake North Burma, and he did not trust the Indian Army. Wingate was ordered to London to brief Churchill. Churchill used but disliked the Indian Army. Wingate regarded it with contempt. In his view, it was a collection of second-rate troops. He referred to it as a vast system of outdoor relief, that is, a way of dealing with unemployment. Churchill liked the phrase so much that he used it for the rest of the war in referring to the Indian Army. Wingate refused to use any Indian Army units in his Chindit formations except for Gurkhas, and he even complained about their fighting qualities. In the nearly 200-year history of the Anglo-Gurkha connection, no other British commander ever has. Churchill and Wingate, who had met briefly before the war, got reacquainted at dinner at 10 Downing Street on the eve of the Prime Minister's departure for the Anglo-American Summit at Quebec, the Quadrant Conference, August-September 1943. In the driven certitude of this military prophet, the Prime Minister saw the solution to a major problem in alliance politics and an escape from dependence on the Indian Army in Britain's war against Japan. Churchill arrived at Quebec in September 1943, suspected by the Americans of not being wholeheartedly committed to their China-oriented strategy for Burma, a suspicion, incidentally, which was quite correct. Wingate arrived with one very expensive long-range penetration operation, to his credit, if that's the right word, and some highly suspect theories about the conduct of future operations. Churchill left Quebec having convinced the Americans the British would retake North Burma, an enormous success in alliance politics. He had put in place a new command structure called Southeast Asia Command to manage the campaign, relegating Army Headquarters India to a supply and support role. Wingate, who when he arrived at Quebec was a substantive lieutenant colonel, emerged a major general, his Chindit force, now officially called Special Force, swollen to the size of an army corps. His skill in finding and dazzling patrons, and Wingate was really, whatever else he was bad at, he was good at finding patrons, was again demonstrated by his handling of the Americans. Suspicious of British good faith in Burma and fed a studied diet of acid disparagement of British competence and courage by Stilwell, both FDR and the U.S. Chiefs of Staff were mesmerized by Wingate. To his private army, General Hap Arnold, the U.S. Air Force Chief of Staff, added a private Air Force. In the upcoming 1943-44 dry weather campaigning season, that is the season that starts with the end of the monsoon in October and runs to the next monsoon the following May, Special Force would lever the Japanese out of North Burma, opening the way for Stilwell's road builders and a flood of American supplies for China. The additional burden imposed on India, Indian logistics, and the disruption imposed on the Indian Army did not, Churchill and Wingate agreed, matter a whit. The Indian Army would not be required to do any more than follow Special Force to mop up and garrison reconquered territory. At least this was what was supposed to happen. What did happen was very different and largely ignored in Churchill's memoirs. To create Chindit columns, Wingate got the entire British 70th Division, one of only 2 British divisions in India at that date, 3 battalions of Gurkhas, and a large number of West African units. Wingate really didn't like African troops either, but apparently anything was better than having Indian troops. The Special Force experiment was, however, a failure. Wingate's Chindits performed prodigies of valor, but at astronomical cost and with virtually no strategic effect. Victory in Burma was not to be their work, but that of the Indian Army. Auchinleck's return as Commander-in-Chief in mid-1943 was the beginning. An Indian Army officer, he set out to rebuild his service. Wavell proved to be a much better viceroy than he had been a Commander-in-Chief. He backed the man known in the Indian Army as the Auk to the hilt. He also tried ceaselessly but vainly to persuade Churchill to reopen the Indian political dialogue. Auchinleck brought a brilliant Indian Army Divisional Commander, Reginald Savory, back from the front to overhaul training and doctrine. But above all, the great reshuffle that followed the end of Wavell's Arakan fiasco vaulted Bill Slim to command of the principal operational formation in the theater, 14th Army. Slim knew from his experience during the 1942 retreat from Burma what needed to be done to build a winning army. And now he had the authority and support to do it. In an astonishingly short time, Auchinleck, Savory, and above all Bill Slim turned the Indian Army around. In spite of Wingate's disruptiveness, until an air crash removed him in March 1944, the Auk, Savory, and Slim forged the weapon that broke the Japanese in the great Imphal-Kohima battles, 1944, on India's eastern frontier. And then in the 44-45 dry season, Slim did what no one else had thought possible. His 14th Army shattered a larger Japanese army, reconquering Burma north to south against the grain of the country and in a dead heat with the next monsoon. It was the most spectacular victory of the war under the British flag, and it was the sunset victory of the old Indian Army. A campaign, incidentally, strongly supported, in many respects enabled by the marvelous piece of technology that hangs just above our head. The Douglas DC-3, the C-47 to the American military, the Dakota to the British. Speak to anyone who served in Burma, and they all have memories of the Dakota, which brought supplies, evacuated wounded, flew through the monsoon. A true wonder weapon in terms of that theater. Not long after VJ Day, Wavell was back in London for consultations with the new Labour government. He paid a courtesy call on Churchill, who was by this time out of office and living in Claridge's hotel. As Wavell prepared to leave, Churchill escorted him to the lift, and as the lift gates closed, Churchill said to the man he had twice fired as a theater commander, made viceroy when no one else in British politics wanted the job, and then refused to heed about Indian politics, "Keep a bit of India." What are we to make in conclusion of all of this? Churchill knew little of India. He disliked what he thought he knew. In particularly, he loathed the Congress Party and mistrusted deeply the Indian Army. But like de Gaulle, who could not imagine France without glory, he could not conceive of Britain as great without empire. And India was the keystone in that imperial arch. To wage the sort of war to which, with their heroic backing, he committed the British people in 1940, he had to squeeze every ounce of effort out of the empire, and especially out of India, and he did. In his memoirs, he said Lend-Lease enabled a nation of 48 million to fight as if it were a nation of 58 million. It is clear that the Indian Empire, in fact, made up much of that demographic deficit, putting in the field an army almost as large as Britain's. Churchill, of course, never acknowledged what Britain's war effort and subsequent victory owed to the Raj and its army. One explanation, perhaps the most important explanation, of this failure by a man who is usually, and quite correctly, noted for his magnanimity, is that Britain's and his triumph in 1945 was rapidly followed by what was clearly, in his mind, the tragedy of imperial decline, made inevitable by the war in which he had so magnificently led his country. In his memoirs, he gave as much space to the purely American victory at Leyte Gulf in 1944 as to Bill Slim's great 1944-45 campaign that reconquered Burma. That victory, by an Indian army transformed by the war, was the prelude not to a reassertion of empire, keep a bit of India, but to its disintegration. It was all too terribly painful to contemplate, much less write about. I think this is why, in the twilight of his life, he told his cousin, Claire Sheridan, that while he had accomplished much, he felt that in the end he had failed in one great thing. The empire in which he believed was gone. Thank you very much.
Your revelation about what the impact of the way Lord Lithgow declared war and joined it on the Muslim League was fascinating. So, by the implication, I know Jinnah had started calling for an independent Pakistan, or what would become of it, in the late 30s. But is it possible that if Lithgow had consulted the Congress Party, that are you literally saying that the path towards an independent Pakistan might have become less realistic?
The question of when the partition of India became inevitable is one that everybody interested in the last days of the British Empire, particularly the Indian Empire, thinks a lot about. Certainly the demand for a separate Muslim homeland had been articulated by not just Jinnah, but by others in the late 30s. The feeling generally, I think, among historians working on this area is that what Jinnah was doing at that point, Jinnah, remember, was not, shall we say, an Orthodox Muslim. He smoked, he drank Scotch whiskey, but what he was an enormously shrewd, English-trained barrister. And he was laying down a marker, a negotiating marker. At that point in the late 30s, it's by no means certain that his mind, or even the minds of many of his close associates, were irrevocably set on partition. But what happens when the war comes into an Indian political situation which is very fluid? Neither the Congress Party nor the Muslim League in many ways were as hostile to the British, who they knew were leaving. Exactly when wasn't clear yet. But the British were walking slowly backward. Their real hostility was against one another. If the war had not come, is it possible the partition of India might have been averted? I think it's possible. It's by no means certain. But what the war did was push the parties further apart. The Congress Party was deeply offended by Linlithgow's action in declaring India at war without any consultation with Indian political opinion. Once the Congress Party had taken the position that they would boycott the government in retaliation for this, the Muslim League was presented with an irresistible opportunity. Because if the Congress Party was going to say, in effect, we're going to pick up our marbles and go home, the Muslim League was in a position, by announcing its support for the war, to collect a great many IOUs. Now, the other thing that's true, in 1939, a very high percentage of the intake for the Indian Army, that is the pre-war army before expansion started, a very high percentage of it was Muslim. It was recruited in the Punjab. So the Muslim League's support for the war effort, the Indian war effort, was very important to the government of India and therefore to London. But with each step in this process, Congress goes into self-imposed exile, the Muslim League rallies to the support of the war effort. With each step, the gap between those two parties widened, and the claim, particularly of the Muslim League, on British support and goodwill got stronger. By 1945, the gap is enormous. Because remember, while the Muslim League is out encouraging people to sign up for the Indian Army, encouraging recruitment, it is the Congress Party which is responsible for the Quit India Revolt in August 1942, the Japanese on the frontier, and the estrangement of the two parties, and particularly the estrangement of the Congress leadership from the government of India, would set the stage for what happens 1945-46. If partition was not inevitable in 1939, and you can make a good argument, I think, on the basis of the evidence that it wasn't, it had become very much more likely by 1945. And it had become virtually inevitable within a year, by 1946, when the Attlee government took a decision which is almost never talked about in the textbooks, but the Attlee government, not long after coming in addition to setting up negotiations, the negotiations which Churchill had always refused to have with Indian political leaders, the Attlee government told the government of India that British troops in India were not, repeat not, to be used to maintain public order. That is, there was still a fairly large contingent of British troops in India at the end of the war, obviously, but they could not be used to keep the two sides apart. What that meant in the last 18 months of the life of the British Raj is what's really maintaining such public order as was maintained in highly volatile areas, like Bengal, which would eventually be partitioned, or the Punjab, which was partitioned, was the Indian Army. It meant you had Indian soldiers who were either Hindu or Muslim or Sikh, acting as peacekeepers and policemen in a quarrel between the communities from which they were drawn, which placed an absolutely intolerable burden on the army, on the Indian Army. The reason the British got out as quickly as they did, people usually say it was Dicky Mountbatten's bad call about the speed of the end game. But I think it was really because if you couldn't use British troops as peacekeepers, and the Attlee government said no, and you had to depend on the Indian Army, the morale and discipline of the Indian Army in those circumstances would inevitably crack under the strain. So you could see the sands running through the hourglass faster and faster as the months passed after the end of the war. That's a 2 or 3 minute summary of how partition came. But the war was critical because the war took a situation which was still malleable, I think, and produced a situation in which a happy resolution, a non-partition resolution, was almost inconceivable.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Callahan.
Thank you, Dr. Callahan, for a illuminating, interesting, invaluable insight into some of the lesser-known aspects. I'm afraid I was as ignorant of the subcontinent as you describe everyone else as being, and I appreciate the information. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Herschel Abbott. I have the honor to serve as chairman of the board of the National World War II Museum. This lecture, the scholarship disclosed in the lecture and throughout the day at the Churchill Symposium is really a prime example of the pride I take in this institution and why we all love to be here and hope that you enjoy it as much as we do. We are focused, of course, on completing our campus and building the next phase of the expansion plan across the street. Looking forward to opening the Freedom Pavilion in December of next year and letting the contract for the Campaign Pavilion in next month. So we are moving forward, but we are also committed to our educational program. And what we've done today and the Mason Lecture Series is, of course, a major part of the educational program as it stands today. We look for ways to expand that program, and we continue to look for ways to carry the message that we have about World War II to the rest of the country. We know we can't get everybody here, so we have to send it out, and we're working on that as well. But of course, the Mason Lecture Series has become a mainstay of that program. We're deeply grateful, as always, to General Mason and his widow for their foundation and for their generous support. For those of you who missed the Churchill Symposium, And for those of you who have been with us all day, I hope to see you at the December International Conference on World War II, where we will bring in renowned historians like those we've had today and war veterans to discuss the early, tenuous months of the war, from Pearl Harbor to Guadalcanal. You may think that's a short period of time, but for those who lived in that period and fought in those theaters, it was an eternity. And I think you'll find it a fascinating program covering 7 and 8 and I think 9 December. Thank you again, Dr. Callahan, for a fabulous presentation. Really very illuminating, and we're grateful for your being here. And his book will be back there, and I think he's willing to sign an autograph or two. Thanks to all of you for coming out tonight. I also want to thank my colleagues on the Board of Trustees of the National World War II Museum and my colleagues on the board of the Churchill Society of New Orleans. Thank all of you for being here and for putting on what has been a fantastic program. And now I want to invite everybody to repair to the back of the room, buy books, and more books. Take the opportunity to get them autographed. Good night, be safe. This symposium and the Mason lecture are adjourned.